Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be looking at a truly profound moment in South African legal history. It's one of those rare moments where a deeply personal, heartbreaking tragedy completely collides with the highest laws of the land, and in doing so, actually transforms constitutional law for an entire nation. We'll be walking through the 2006 constitutional court case of Mark Gory, unpacking exactly how a grieving man's fight just to keep his own home turned into a massive, landmark victory for equality. Okay, let's dive into this by asking a difficult but very real question. Who inherits your estate when the law outright refuses to recognize your relationship? I mean, imagine losing the person you've built your whole life with, only to be told by the state that, legally speaking, you're practically a stranger to them. Your shared home, your assets, your entire life together literally erased on paper, just because the legal framework hasn't caught up to the reality of your relationship. That is the exact devastating scenario Mark Gory faced, and it perfectly highlights the severe human cost of outdated legislation.
To figure out how this was all resolved, we're going to break this explainer down into 5 quick parts. First, a tragic dispute. Second, the constitutional conflict. Third, fixing the law. Fourth, the retrospectivity dilemma. And finally, resolving the estate.
Let's start with part 1, a tragic dispute. Right at the center of this massive constitutional battle were two real people, Mark Gory and his late partner, Henry Harrison Brooks. Now, they shared a home, they supported each other, basically functioning exactly like a married couple. But when Henry died suddenly in 2005 without a will, it triggered a legal mechanism called intestate succession. That's just the default legal process that determines exactly who inherits an estate when there's no paperwork. Usually, the law automatically steps in to protect the surviving spouse. But here's the catch. Because Mark and Henry were a same-sex couple, they weren't legally permitted to marry at the time.
Let's trace how fast this unfolded. Following Henry's death in April 2005, his parents immediately stepped in, claiming to be his intestate heirs. They even nominated a man named Daniel Kolver to be the executor of the estate. Almost overnight, Kolver and the parents started removing assets from the home Mark had shared with Henry. Kolver was even taking steps to sell the house right out from under him. So facing the total loss of his home and his partner's assets, Mark Gory took swift legal action in October of 2005, suing for his inheritance. And by March 2006, the High Court actually ruled in Gory's favor, which completely set the stage for the constitutional court review we are examining today.
Moving on to part 2, the constitutional conflict. So you might be wondering, why on earth did the executor and the parents think they had the right to just bypass Mark Gory entirely? Well, the answer lies in a direct clash between an old parliamentary act and a brand new constitution. The absolute crux of the issue is found in Section 1, Subsection 1 of the Intestate Succession Act of 1987. That law explicitly stated that if a person died without a will, the estate went to their surviving spouse. But back in 1987, the legal definition of a spouse strictly meant a heterosexual married partner. Because permanent same-sex life partners like Mark couldn't legally marry, they were totally excluded from this automatic protection. Legally speaking, under that specific act, Mark Gory had zero claim to Henry Brooks' estate.
But here's where the number 9 changes the whole shebang. Section 9 of the South African Constitution, which came into effect years after that 1987 act, strictly prohibits unfair discrimination on several grounds, and that includes sexual orientation. The Constitutional Court took one look at the 1987 act and saw a glaring, undeniable contradiction. Excluding same-sex life partners who had committed to supporting each other from inheriting, simply because they weren't allowed to marry, was a massive violation of the equality and dignity rights guaranteed by Section 9. The old law was just fundamentally unconstitutional, no two ways about it.
Which brings us to part 3, fixing the law. Now, it's one thing for a court to just declare a law unconstitutional, right? But how do they actually fix it without throwing out and rewriting the entire statute book? And this brilliantly illustrates the judicial remedy the court decided to use, a really clever technique called reading in. The original, discriminatory text simply said, survived by a spouse. So the court basically acted like an editor, directly inserting the words, or partner in a permanent same-sex life partnership in which the partners have undertaken reciprocal duties of support. Just like that, they ensured the marginalized group was immediately protected without tossing the whole law. Here's the mechanical logic behind how they did that. First, the court identifies the unconstitutional omission, in this case, leaving out same-sex partners. Second, they figure out the exact, precise words needed to cure that defect without messing up the legislature's overall intention. And third, they literally read those words right into the statute. You might ask, why not just tell the legislature to go write a new law?
Well, the court noted that Parliament had been dragging its feet dealing with discrimination against gays and lesbians on a super piecemeal basis. Waiting around for a new law would leave grieving people like Mark Gory completely unprotected in the meantime. So reading in provided immediate, real-world relief.
That takes us to Part 4, the retrospectivity dilemma.
Okay, so if the court changes the law today, what happens to all the people who died yesterday? How far back in time does this judicial fix actually go? The complication here comes from a concept called objective constitutional invalidity. I know, it sounds super academic, but it basically just means that an unconstitutional law doesn't just magically become invalid on the day the judge bangs the gavel. It is considered invalid from the very moment the Constitution itself took effect. Since the interim Constitution started on April 27, 1994, that Intestate Succession Act had actually been unconstitutional since 1994. Therefore, Mark Gory was legally Henry Brooks' heir from the exact second Henry died in 2005. But applying this retroactively, that creates a massive headache for estates across the country that have already been finalized and closed.
To show you just how messy this gets, let's look at two different estates. In the Brooks estate, you've got Mark Gory fighting Henry's parents. Simple enough. But during this very trial, another group actually asked to intervene, the Stark sisters. Their brother, William Stark, had died without a will in late 2005. Under the old law, his sisters were the legal heirs, and that money went to them immediately. But William had an alleged same-sex partner, a man named Bobby Lee Bell. If the court makes this new reading-in rule retrospective, the Stark sisters will retroactively lose their inheritance to Mr. Bell. So retrospectivity directly pit the constitutional rights of marginalized partners against the vested financial rights of innocent third-party family members. It's a real tug-of-war.
The Constitutional Court had to carefully balance those competing interests. They ruled that yes, the law absolutely applies retroactively back to April 1994, meaning same-sex partners have inheritance rights dating back to the dawn of the new Constitution. However, and this is a big however, to prevent total administrative chaos, the court said that if an estate has already been wound up and a bona fide, meaning innocent heir, has already received the property, that transfer is fully protected, it cannot be reversed. But if an heir took the property knowing there was a pending legal challenge, which is exactly what Brooks' parents did, they are not protected. Finally, the court built in a safety valve, allowing parties to go to court for a variation if this backward-looking rule causes serious administrative problems.
And finally, Part 5, resolving the estate.
Let's bring this back down to the human level. What actually happened to Mark Gory, the executor, and the House? Well, the executor of the estate, Daniel Kolver, was officially removed by the court. There had been a complete breakdown of trust between him and Mark. But the court made a very nuanced, fair decision regarding the legal costs. The lower court had originally ordered Kolver to pay Gory's legal fees out of his own pocket. The Constitutional Court actually overturned that. They acknowledged that, hey, while Kolver was definitely insensitive, he was technically just following the letter of the 1987 law as it existed at that exact moment. He couldn't legally recognize Mark until the court officially struck the law down. So punishing him personally just wasn't fair.
Ultimately, though, the resolution was a massive triumph for Mark Gory. He and Henry Brooks were officially declared by the highest court in the land to be partners in a permanent same-sex life partnership with reciprocal duties of support. Mark was declared the sole intestate heir. The executor's attempt to sell their shared house completely voided. And Henry Brooks' parents were ordered to return every single personal asset they had removed from Mark's home within 7 days.
Actually, scratch that. The court wasn't quite done yet. If the executor wasn't going to pay those hefty legal costs, who was? Justice Van Heerden had this incredibly powerful note in the judgment. The state is under an ongoing constitutional obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights by ensuring that legislation which violates constitutional rights is amended. Basically, the court squarely blamed the government for leaving a clearly unconstitutional law on the books for over a decade, forcing ordinary citizens to litigate piece by piece just to get their basic human rights. Because of that foot-dragging, the court ordered the Minister of Justice to pay the legal costs for both Mark Gory and the executor.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider. How many more grieving families must endure the emotional and financial cost of piecemeal litigation while waiting for the legislature to update discriminatory laws? Mark Gory won his home and his dignity, for sure, but he had to take his fight all the way to the highest court in the land while actively mourning the love of his life. It's a powerful reminder that while constitutions promise equality, it is so often ordinary people who have to force the law to actually keep its promises. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will catch you next time.